Welcome to Game Theory, a smarter way to play. This week we're taking a closer look at interactive storytelling. Gaming's first must-see feature, it's since become something of a long-lost art over the last couple decades. But suddenly, a new chapter is being written. From captivating dialogue to arresting plot development, game makers are increasingly rediscovering the power of prose. Join us as we start by examining where virtual storytelling's tale began.
At the very beginning, it didn't exist. I would be so bold as to say that Ultima 4 was one of the first true attempts at in-depth storytelling through gameplay, to where the focus of the gameplay was not purely on leveling up and beating the next monster, but was really on the more in-depth interaction you had with the story. That carried on, not only through my own games, but other kind of fantasy role-playing games during what I'll call the middle Ultima era. Ultimas 4 through 7, because the time for me is generally marked in Ultimas. And then it kind of fell out of vogue for a while.
There was a moment when gaming changed my life. I owned a tour company, a travel company, and I told my wife, if I'm doing this when I'm 50, this is really bad. 2 weeks after my 30th birthday, I sold that tour company and started to work on a book. 2 years come and go, and the book is not finished. My father, who was involved in computers from the very early days, had a TRS-80. On that computer was a game called Zork. That moment of playing Zork and seeing that imagination and writing could meet gameplay was transformative.
I remember being shown King's Quest I at a friend's house, and I fell in love. And after that, I became this rabid Sierra fanboy. Felt like this infinitely deep universe, residing, on my computer floppy disk. But because mechanics back then were relatively simple and straightforward, that story is what started to elevate games. Everything from the Sierra to the LucasArts games, they paved the way for the idea, I guess, of game storytelling. Back then, these games were, they were huge. These were the big, AAA blockbusters of the day.
I think in the early days of PCs, PCs were much slower and much rarer, so you had more kind of nerds who had them in their homes. You kind of got subsumed by the action crowd when PCs became fast enough to do action games. Those people have remained out there sort of like hungry baby birds, asking for things and not getting them, and now we see with the casual gaming space that we're really growing a whole new demographic.
Hey, everyone loves a good comeback story, right? You have to wonder, though, despite its massive initial success, when did interactive fiction's influence first begin to wane? And with virtual storytelling on the rise again, why have the years brought so many ups and downs?
In the early 90s, there was an increasing interest in graphics, let's say. And so you saw a lot of games that focused primarily on creating, at least from a visual perspective, cool worlds, but not as interested in populating them with interesting characters or interesting stories. There wasn't as much recognition at the time that context was important.
The emphasis on storytelling for developers sort of goes back and forth in popularity. There was a point in time when we were enamored with the Hollywood scriptwriters, and every game had to have a Hollywood scriptwriter on it. That didn't work out. Then we went back to, okay, let's just focus on gameplay. Now we're starting to turn the corner again, and we're starting to think about storytelling.
A lot of the Japanese role-playing games during 1632-bit era kept it alive. And I think that they then opened the door for a lot of the third-person games that started coming out. The action-adventure, which used to really just be called the platformer, I guess, became the sort of next wave of game genre to incorporate storytelling.
Well, what happened when PlayStation came out was everything moved to 3D, and the publishers were obsessed with 3D. And the interesting thing is that Broken Sword actually came out on the PlayStation, and Virgin, who's our publisher, had no interest in publishing it whatsoever. It went on, and in Europe it sold 350,000. It was a smash hit. And in many ways, the publishers are actually out of touch with the audience.
3 or 4 years ago, there began to be a number of the what I call action RPGs with heavy story theme that began to show up on top of it again, and in many ways a much more sophisticated way than at least I had done through those middle Ultimas, but still rarely with the elegance of what I'll call the final art that you perceive in a linear narrative of a book or perceive in a linear narrative of a movie. I don't think we've yet mastered the techniques of true interactive storytelling And I mean that not just in dialogue, not just in cut scenes, but really in the entire experience unfolding and how you emotionally become engaged in what's going on.
I'll start with everyone's favorite, Uncharted 2, and I think that what they do, aside from just brilliant writing and interaction in general, they've managed to merge gameplay and narrative, so it's not that often that you stop just to watch a cutscene. A lot of times you are participating and playing as the story is being told. BioShock had two things that were really cool. I think they made the environment, the city, Rapture, whatever, a character. And I also like the really, again, simple decision to set a lot of the story to the audio diaries, because again, you can continue to play through the game and you hear this story sort of being told in your ear. It adds to the immersion. BioWare games, Mass Effect 2 and Dragon Age, they're amazing with their characters. I think they've really nailed creating relationships and creating like interesting and distinct personalities. Even when they have a cast of, dozens, I remember all their names.
Regardless, in the era of HD graphics and online games, it's still pretty strange to see storytelling touted as a killer app. So what's to explain the resurgence, you might ask? Well, good question, especially considering all the challenges that interactive writers face.
Stories are how we as humans explain the world. When we see a sequence of events happen, even if those events are not interconnected, we will invent connections to just make sense out of what happened to us. I'm not surprised that storytelling is back. I don't know that it ever left. It's just that we're not very good at it still.
I think it's like comic books or rap. It is an art form of the people. I do think there's recognition of that, and there will continuing to be recognition. I think the longer you get away from something, the more it kind of has this shine of respect. I think interactivity can be as profound an entertainment experience as any that we have, including film and books. It doesn't have to be about being childish or being sheerly entertaining. It can also be profound and meaningful.
The challenge for the gaming industry is always how to create dialogue that players just aren't going to fast forward through. We're still evolving the art form, we're evolving the medium. We're trying to figure out what dialogue will work, because you don't have a linear flow like you have with movies. It starts and it stops. And it's very jarring when it does that.
In movies and other visual media, the storytelling rule is don't tell, show. Well, in a game, the rule is don't show, but play. Tell the story through playing.
We still haven't resolved some of the fundamental issues of storytelling in games. The issue of giving player agency, which is a fancy way of saying letting the player do what he wants to do, versus having the player do what the character that he's playing, for example, might do. Say, if you're playing a kind and gentle person, and that's the nature of the character, and then you give the player the choice to kill a kitten, where does that leave you as a storyteller? You're saying, this is a kind and gentle person who kills kittens. And that can be difficult.
Sounds slightly disturbing, doesn't it? Nonetheless, you'd be pretty amazed at some of the hurdles that today's designers have to overcome. Thankfully, critics have yet to write the final word on video game storytelling.
I never realised when I was a journalist just how hard it was. I think I have a little bit of residual guilt that maybe I was kind of too harsh on storytelling in some of my reviews and didn't realise the kind of heartbreak and kind of brutality that goes into trying to create a story for games. Unlike in movies and TVs, story is often the last thing thought about and the first thing pulled apart.
There's room for all sorts of different kinds of narrative experiences. I don't think they all have to be, and they aren't all, right? AAA, big budget titles, for example, is Braid, and that tells a really, interesting and heartfelt story, and it's an XBLA title. And they're really interesting because they explore very specific, moments in time, or like a very specific emotion. And those are just as, and in some cases even more important forms of storytelling.
I do believe like a lot of games are still mimicking the movies and trapping people in cinematics. Which is unfortunate because as much as I love movies, I think video games is its own media, and there are things that we can do. We can go further than movies. We can actually let the player do those things as opposed to be a spectator.
There are many, many ways to tell story in games. We certainly made a very deliberate creative choice in the creation of the Uncharted games to tell a linear story and to craft moment-to-moment choice for the player. But the great thing is that that's not the only way to go about great storytelling in games. There are approaches like those of the BioShock series, which are somewhat more open world, where the story can unfold in somewhat different ways, all the way through to the storytelling in very open world games like Grand Theft Auto. So yeah, there are all these different things that you can do, and the possibilities right now are just seeming almost boundless.
Still, as we at Game Theory remind you, the answers are never simple. As this week's homework assignment, we invite you to consider the following questions. Of all the games which have sparked your imagination, how many actually use traditional storytelling methods? Do video games really need actual scripts or voiceovers to tell an effective tale? How are new storytelling approaches affecting the way you define today's leading game genres? And be sure to hit us up at our website, GameTheoryOnline.com, to share your thoughts. Catch you next time on Game Theory. This is your professor, Scott Steinberg, signing off.